Thank you. So hello everyone. My name is Drew Ryder. I'm a history student. I'm primarily interested in social and cultural interactions of certain people on this side of the room. Social and cultural interactions of servicemen, and in particular my project is on the everyday lives and experiences of British soldiers in the Korean War. It's more or less an investigation into just that, into what the everyday life and experience was like for British Army personnel throughout the 1950 to 53 conflict. It's not what I would describe as a strategic military history, in that it's more to do with the worm's eye view, to borrow a phrase from John Ellis, of what the soldiers' lives were like. It's the sort of study which is quite common in terms of First and Second World War historiography, but is much rarer when it comes to lesser well-known conflicts throughout the 20th century, the Korean War being considerably less well-known than the two major world conflicts that preceded it. Now, as part of this study, I've been looking into the interactions between, or the interpersonal reactions between British soldiers and their counterparts in the field. And as part of that, I've been looking at how they interacted with their allies, and as part of that, the largest allied force in the war, which was the United States Army. Which leads me into my title for today, which is Allies and Animosities between British soldiers and US troops in the Korean War. Now, just before I start, again, this isn't a strategic study of the relations between the British and US armies. Those sort of studies have been covered at length in more conventional military histories, the likes of Max Hastings, sort of just thorough-throughs of the war. But again, there is nothing really being done into what the actual British soldier on the ground thought of his American colleagues. Before I do get into the full swing of what this presentation is about, I will cover a general discussion of what I'm going to be talking about today, a quick overview of the Korean War for anyone who isn't strictly familiar with it, because I wasn't familiar with it until I started looking at it. And then I'll get into what my actual evidence is and my understandings and some of my conclusions. So obviously, I'm going to do a general overline of what it was, talk a little bit about what my project is in general and how I've built up my research base. Then I'm going to look at a few key areas in which there were animosities. Now again, just very quickly, animosity wasn't the singular key feature of Anglo-American relations in the Korean War. However, it is a key theme which has cropped up quite a lot in my research, so I thought it was worthy of a brief discussion. So within animosities itself, we're going to be looking at how cultural differences between British and American forces contributed to this, how combat rivalry and communication rivalry contributed to this, and I will explain all of these terms when I come to them a bit more clearly, and how logistics and self-prioritization came into effect in the combat theatre. Then I'll recap sort of what this shows us and what this tells us about the experience of British soldiers. And I would open up to questions, but I think we're going to leave that until a bit later. So, outline of the Korean War. The Korean War started in the July of 1950 with the North Korean invasion of South Korea. And this little GIF is going to prove no end of problem because it sort of finishes and then I have to restart it. But throughout the course of the war, 41 nations from around the world, both Western and Eastern Bloc, were involved in the fighting. Over 6 million fighters across the whole of the war, depending on which source you look at. Now, of those 6 million, about 100,000 of those troops were from the United Kingdom, with a peak strength of 14,500. Just to put that into perspective, that is about double the number of British servicemen who served in the Afghan conflict. With casualty numbers about twice that of Afghanistan. So a considerable number of British forces were involved, and yet there is no cohesive study of what their experience was like in the same terms that we see for the First and Second World Wars. Now, for the British soldier in Korea, or for the British Army in general in Korea, there are three major stages of the conflict. If I can try and restart, there we go. So Britain enters the war at this stage, and there is a considerable rollback of the North Korean army across the very mountainous and rugged terrain of the Korean peninsula. When UN forces reached the Chinese border, this caused a bit of an outcry with the Chinese, who promptly counter-invaded and forced the Allied back to about this level of the peninsula. And that was the stage of the war which most people would be familiar with, if anyone is familiar with it. The most notable, or the most famous battles, like the Battle of Imjin, occurred during this rollback. But following this, there was a third and final phase of the war, which saw the Allies push back to the now famous 38th parallel, and a change of mission mandate, which was to hold the line roughly where the war had started, and which is the same state the Korean conflict remains in to this day, which is where the DMZ now is. Now, what does this mean for my project and my research? Well, the Korean War was the first major conflict the British Army was involved with, in which it was tested as part of a United Nations force, as opposed to a League of Nations or a Allied army, as had been in the First and Second World War. And it's been well documented amongst historians how the Allies and the different armies, but it's been well documented how the various armies interacted with each other on a strategic level. There are great books at how General MacArthur regarded his allies. But again, my study is not about the commander's tale, this is about the soldiers on the ground and their experience. And to that end, my research has been drawn up from first-hand accounts of the fighting and the war, mostly from the Imperial War Museum, who have over 2,000 hours of recordings of Korean War veterans. So primarily from the soldiers themselves, from diaries from the time and memoirs. And sort of just to preface everything else I'm about to talk about, it does all come from the personal opinions of British soldiers. So it does paint particularly unfavourable pictures of their allies, but again, it's what they felt at the time and what they have deemed worthy of remembering, rather than the strategic overview. So to move into animosities, again, animosity is not the singular aspect of the British soldiers' opinion of their American colleagues throughout the Korean conflict. This was a very wide, or their opinion of their allies in general was a very wide spectrum. It varied from person to person, as human interaction tends to do. And yeah, it's rather difficult to pin down. However, animosity is one of the, and sort of a mutual dislike or distrust is something that continually crops up, and I thought something that would be worth looking into. So the whole goal of my presentation today is to take us through that. So firstly, I'm going to very quickly go over how a general cultural difference between British Army culture and US Army culture led to a dislike from the very offset. And then I will look into how combat rivalry and competition, as opposed to cooperation, influenced the manner in which Allies interacted in the field and on the front. And very quickly I'll look at logistical prioritisation. And again, I will get to all that as I can. Now, in terms of cultural differences, we say that nothing is as important as a first impression, and this was as true in 1950s Korea as it is for us today. So, going into the Korean conflict, the British Army and the American Army were different forces than they had been 5 and 10 years ago in the Second World War, just purely in terms of demographics. The number of servicemen who had fought in the Second World War was considerably lower than we might expect. These were the younger brothers, cousins, or even sons of Second World War combatants, as opposed to the same army. And reflecting that, very small numbers of British troops had direct experience of even meeting an American at this time in world history. Obviously, a large number had experienced American culture. They'd seen the cinema and the radios. But they'd probably never met an American in their life, so it's very difficult to judge what their expectations may have been of US personnel. It's much easier to judge what their first impressions were across the board. As a general rule of thumb, it's found that British NCOs and soldiers on the ground found their American counterparts in the ranks to be a bit boorish, brash, gung-ho, and a bit disrespectful of their allies. If we look higher up the command chain, officers found the US practices in war to be very conflicting with their own ideas of how a force should be run. And to explain some of these, I'm going to run through a couple of quotes. The first is from Private Roy Martin, who went out with the 29th Brigade in 1950. And his take on the American GI is quite reflective of the typical first interaction. So as he said, I didn't rate the Americans. They were all mouth, always rabbiting on. They'd always talk loud and make sure you knew they were Americans. And I don't think I made a single friend amongst them throughout the entire war. The Canadians were there as well, and they were different. They were on the boat over. But the Americans were always on about getting to the front and getting stuck into the fighting. I will unpack all of these statements in just a second, but I will proceed onwards and jump up a couple of ranks to Sergeant Major George Patterson, who was with the Black Watch much later in the war. He's describing how when Allied units would take over from one another, because they weren't constantly on the front line, they would rotate out. Whenever we were to hand over a position in the line, we made sure it was as pristine as possible for the next unit moving in. We always did a clean-up, so it was for our relief as we had found it. Of course, quite often we didn't find it in much of a condition. That's right, quite often it wasn't in much of a condition when we first found it. The Americans usually left their lines in a hell of a state. It was just sloppy. Rubbish and casings everywhere. We wouldn't dream of leaving a position in just a state. So, to an extent, a mutual disjoin or distrust between the cultures of the two armies is somewhat to be expected. However, what we can unpack from these statements is how on the front line there was an expectation that the Americans would not necessarily be the ideal Allied soldier. They would be very disrespectful towards you. They wouldn't necessarily treat your position the way you would like it to be treated. And there was an expectation that they would be gung-ho, ready for combat, almost cinematic in their approach to fighting. And if we look at the British attitudes towards fighting, and that it had to be a little bit, well, it had to be meticulous and routine, it's a cultural break. Obviously those didn't always occur in practice, but the ideas and thinking on it were considerably different. Now this, if we put it higher up the chain, could lead to some severe problems. This is a comparatively humorous analogue from Colonel Jeffs, who was a staff officer with the 29th and was on the bridge of the HMS Unicorn, taking troops from Hong Kong to Korea in 1950. And what he describes is a difference of opinion and culture between a US captain and the captain of the HMS Unicorn. We were then put into an American task force, and each one of those has a number. And as the captain of the American cruiser was senior to the captain of the Unicorn, so he became the task force commander. And he signalled to the Unicorn that it would henceforth be designated as .95, and the captain of the Unicorn wouldn't have it. He signalled back that he would not have his ship referred to as some decimal point or digit, and that it was to be the HMS Unicorn and nothing else. This discussion went on for some considerable time. Now, it's quite funny to imagine this petty little spat between officers going on across a semaphore line in a very sort of Dad's Army fashion. But it is quite telling of the approach between the different armed forces and the different cultures. To the United States Navy, in this case, it wouldn't bat an eyelid to refer to as an illustrious ship by a decimal point. It's all for the practicality of the mission, it's .95. But the captain of the HMS Unicorn, who had served with great honours in the Second World War, no, you refer to your ship as your ship. It's something that you fought for and earned. And not to say that the Americans didn't hold this opinion, but that the cultures could clash when it came to real-life situations. Now, this is quite a comical side of it. What I'm about to dive into, when it came into the actual combat sphere, is considerably darker.
You've had 15 minutes, so can you pick out the main
points?
Okay,
I'm really sorry.
No, that's great.
The map behind me is a summarizer, or it's a map of the Battle of Nak Tong early in the war, and it's a case when combat rivalry did not favour, or it was not especially very good. So the three key points on this map I just need to draw attention to is this is where I'll be again quoting Colonel Jeffs was stationed. a chap named Major Wilson was stationed on this hill line and Private Jones on the front line of the fighting. And just quickly summarise what this was. It was part of the Allied break across the Nakton River. So they progressed along this road, and the Argylls had been tasked with clearing this hill. Now, it's for Colonel Jeff's statement on the event. The North Koreans had formed up on this hillside and were firing down on the Argylls across the river. We no longer had support from the big guns, which had been moved to cover MacArthur's landings further over. So we needed the aeroplanes. We called for air support, and the Americans sent us a spotter for the Mustangs to drop napalm. Now, this fellow never actually crossed the river, never got near it, and could not see the target zone. So when the pilots radioed in asking which hillsides to drop the bombs on, he gave them the wrong position, and the Mustangs dropped their napalm on our men. The whole thing was a disaster. So that was Colonel Jeffs, who was with the spotter back several miles behind the front line. The next one's from Major Wilson, who was watching it from another part of the front line. We only had 3 companies, 2 got to the top and held, but then the disaster happened. Our liaison officer, who was on the wrong side of the river and couldn't see the actual target when the 2 companies called for air support, and he relayed the wrong information. The arrangement with the Americans for air support wasn't very good in those days. We had fluorescent streams to signify we were friendly. The 3 pilots buzzing round said they could see the screens and that they wouldn't attack, but the liaison officer, again the American radio officer who was on the wrong side of the river, stated that there were no US forces on the hill and that they should continue with the attack. 2 companies were badly shot off with cannon and napalm, and the casualties were quite bad. Kenny Moore in command there was killed and subsequently given a VC. I could see everything and there was nothing I could do. I think I was the last person to talk to him on the wireless, and I was telling him to get off the hill. We were all hopping mad at the Americans. I remember having the same feeling during the Gulf War when they did it again, and there was talk of suing the American Air Force. The American Air Force pilots were absolutely horrified when they found out what happened, of course, especially when they discovered that the order came from their man at brigade headquarters. It took us out of the fighting for some days. Again, I'll unpack these in a second, just because we're very short on time and I'm very sorry. The last one comes from Private Jones, and to summarise, he was actually on the hill where the napalm hit. So he had a very much frontline view of what happened. And he talked about how seeing the American Mustangs come in at first was something very cheerful, and it gave them all hope, which very quickly disappeared when the bombs landed on their troops. And he described very vividly what happened and the effect of seeing men running from this wall of flame, and how the bombs had actually landed where they were keeping their wounded in stretchers. But the main points to come from here is that everyone was very upset by what had happened and very particularly blamed the Americans, and how they made sure that all of the new reinforcements heard about what happened on Hill 282, which was where the bombs landed. So the key points to unpack from all of those are cases of combat rivalry. So the support and logistics side of it, the Americans had moved their artillery to prioritise covering their forces, which from a strategic point of view is a perfectly rational decision, but from the point of view of their allies, was a bit not the done thing. That the idea being that we are, or from the British soldiers' point of view, we have come to fight in this war, but we are not given the support. And the second is that the liaison officer, the spotter, couldn't particularly be bothered to do his job for the sake of soldiers who weren't for his army, and he stayed a long way away from the front line, which resulted in the deaths of about 20 Argyll servicemen and the wounding of 72 others. And I don't think I need to say that the napalm wounding is not a particularly pleasant experience. Now, the reactions to this very quickly. Private Searle, who was on the other side of the valley but was witness to it, described how it's not just an American phenomenon of prioritising your lives over your others, and that the British could do it to the Americans. Talking about a time later on in the war where his half-track had temporarily been stopped at the side of the road, the Americans went past on ahead of us in the lorry, and the next we saw them, they were driving across this bridge over a little river gorge. They came under heavy fire and were all jumping out of the truck, and some went cleave over the side into the riverbank. It was quite comical, really. We didn't hang around to see what happened after that. So, not especially typical behaviour of what we would consider allies in battle. So what does this all tell us? And I'll wrap this up as fast as I can. British and American soldiers were less inclined to like each other on an individual level than might be expected. They considered each other to be, or the British considered the Americans to be quite brash and battle-ready and not necessarily professional soldiers. Strategic alliances did not necessarily produce goodwill on the ground, as we saw with resources being shifted away from forces that needed them, or the consideration that they thought that was what was happening, and it led to soldiers disregarding the lives of their counterparts in favour of their own side. And also the individual interactions can vary from person to person. So I'm very, very sorry for running over.
Thank you very much.
But yeah.